Hi, everyone. I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum where experts provide clear, data-driven insight into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. 2018 was a significant year for tech policy. One issue we heard a lot about was internet privacy and how our data is being used. Will Rinehart, AAF's Director of Technology and Innovation Policy, has written about these issues extensively, and he is here today to break down the issues surrounding internet privacy for us. Will, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let me set up this debate over data privacy with a specific example. I'm walking down the street, I pass a Starbucks,
Yeah.
my Starbucks app gives me a notification saying, hey, do you want to buy coffee?
Yeah. And you say no because Starbucks is horrible.
Well, I say
Yeah.
no because I'm coming to the office.
Yeah,
and,
of course. I'm just joking around.
So is this how we should be thinking about data privacy? Is this,
Yeah. So the Starbucks app actually was just recently brought up in a House hearing about privacy, and I think this is actually illustrative of this kind of general problem that we're talking about with privacy. Privacy itself really is this kind of associational term. There's a lot of different ways to think about privacy, but typically the two ways we think about privacy, or at least within the policy sphere, we're really concerned about data privacy, which are really questions of data control, data knowledge, and what consumers can do with data. It's not illegal to do these things, but it's just the ability to have control over your data in specific contexts. Now that can be compared to what you might consider, or what is considered rather, data security. And data security is really the thing that we worry about and are considering whenever your credit card gets stolen. So data security is really about ensuring the databases themselves are secure, making sure that people, aren't being subjected to fraudulent activity. And really the problem I see is that oftentimes data security is combined with data privacy, even though those really are two separate terms. And that's really, at least when we talk about this kind of federal privacy law, we really tend to smash the two together when we really shouldn't. At the end of the day, really what people worry about with that kind of the app that you're mentioning, the Starbucks app, is that, perhaps Starbucks is collecting information about me that they don't necessarily need in order to serve me delightfully tasteful coffee in extremely large mugs. So perhaps, I think that's what consumers are thinking about when they think about these types of experiences. They're worried that perhaps this company is collecting a little bit too much information. They're not necessarily worried as much about their information necessarily getting out, which might be much more of a data security question. They're much more concerned about, well, why is it that Starbucks needs to collect this information about me? Why is it that, for example, some flashlight apps on my iPhone are collecting information about all my contacts I have? That's much more of those types of concerns about collection of data and how that data is being used for specific purposes, I think is what a lot of people care about within this conversation, which means that perhaps we're only really focused in this privacy conversation on a set core problems that we're trying to deal with, which I think is interesting, because we tend to combine these core problems with a whole bunch of other things, like I said, like fraudulent activity, medical or identity theft, which is increasing, or even perhaps seniors getting defrauded out of money because they went on a website and put information. So to me, it's really helpful to separate out the two, and really to have a conversation about privacy. You really do need to start by saying, well, there's things about data security that we might want to do, and there's things with data privacy that we might want to do.
Now, in the case of the Starbucks example, there's been a lot of focus on how these companies, manipulate us into making decisions. You go to Amazon, you see you might be interested in this list or something like that. Yeah. But there's clear benefits to having our data out there on the internet.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through some of those benefits?
Yeah, and I think that what you've highlighted, especially with Amazon, is this kind of dual nature with the what sometimes feels creepy, but I think also is clearly beneficial, that individuals do tend to have patterns, that they do tend to like. One thing that I really like reading about is, interestingly enough, are technology books about technology and about technology policy, and like books about history. So I often will get new stuff coming up and saying, hey, you read this other thing, maybe you're interested in this product. When we're talking about selecting books to read, I don't necessarily see a harm from that, but some people are kind of uncomfortable with those type of information, that information being there, that it's like forcing you to choose certain types of things, that it's manipulating you. I personally, I'm trying to think through that, and I think that's a really, really difficult question, and it's kind of its own separate issue that is obviously related to privacy. And I think the other thing that we should mention here when we're talking about privacy laws, and the reason why I'm using kind of like these associational terms, is that whenever we talk about privacy, there's a lot that is really connected with it and tied with it, and so we just need to be very clear when we're parsing out these problems. What is it that we're trying to solve? What's the issue that we're trying to solve? But there are clear benefits to these things. For example, social media right now is there's a lot of social media platforms, and it seems that when you actually take the totality of it, that consumers benefit by about $7 trillion per year because they're using social media instead of, maybe they're at work and they're using social media, but when there's ways to figure out basically that people use social media X%, X many hours of the year. There's so many people that are using this every single year that when you do those kind of number crunching, you get about $7 trillion of consumer worth that people get from using these platforms. And I think that's actually something to continually point out, that yes, that these platforms, these online technologies really do benefit. I'm able to keep connected with, I'm able to keep in touch and connected with my cousins, my mom's cousins, who we're still very good friends with, and in the East Coast. And so to me, I see a clear amount of benefits to these things that I think that we should be highlighting, because there are obviously some problems. I'm not going to deny that there are problems with some of the largest platforms. There's been some legal issues that, I'm glad that the FTC is probably bringing a suit to make sure that companies are being honest with their with their customers. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't deny that there are clear benefits to these kind of technologies.
I think you just hit a key point there. It's about being honest with your customers.
Yes.
I think a lot of this has been like, I didn't know this was happening.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because it was buried in some legal lease document or some update that just automatically generates.
Or perhaps they didn't really say, we were doing this kind of collection, which I think those are clear cases where really the FTC should be going after companies, which they are. They're looking to go after Google and Facebook for this kind of deception, which I think is I don't want to say it's a good thing, but it's what needs to be done.
Right.
It's not a good thing, because whenever there's deception involved, that's just not really a good thing. But the fact that the FTC is going after these type of nefarious actions, I think, is actually very, very true. It is something that we need to be that we need to be thinking positively of, that this is how the system works. This is, you got to trust the process.
Now, a lot of these companies are already sort of, doing this exact thing where they're giving you more control over your data on the back end anyways. So it seems that's where the industry is going already. Yeah,
very much so. And I think that is a clear market development. And it's really happened gradually over the last couple of years, and really over the last, I shouldn't even say last couple of years. It really has been the last 10 years you've had this development within, as these companies have grown and as they have collected more information, and that they produce more information. They've given consumers generally, more options to limit the kinds of information that is allowed. They limit the kind of audiences that can have access to that information, and they keep on adding in and rolling out new features. I haven't seen it recently, but I believe both Google and Facebook this last week came with a whole new bunch of features, if I recall correctly. So they're constantly working at these things, and this is a continual development. It's a process. It's something that is hugely important, but we shouldn't deny that there's this kind of push and pull within the market for companies sometimes getting chastised by journalists and by advocates, and then companies then responding to those kind of correctives.
So how should we think about balancing these benefits with the drawbacks that are involved? Does each person just basically at some point have to take control for themselves, or is there some sort of other policy proposal out there that we should be thinking about this?
So to me, I mean, the one thing that we really haven't talked about yet is that there already are a set of laws that are going to be enacted. This is California has their Privacy Act, which is known as the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. That's going into law in 2020. So for me, when you're asking, okay, what is it that we can be doing? What's the holistic picture look like? What's the all of the above approach look like? I think really what it looks like, at least going forward, is the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, going after companies, which we know that they're doing that. They've got open cases against, I think, both Facebook and Google. I know for sure Facebook, they're bringing a multi-billion-dollar fine, or likely to bring a multi-billion-dollar fine against them. So you've got an agency policing that. You've got the state AGs that also do that kind of work. So these are the state attorneys general. They're the ones who go after companies that are violating certain kinds of state privacy laws. You've got California is going to get into the fray. I personally would like to kind of see how things shake out a little bit before I think there's clear benefits to doing a federal privacy law at this point, primarily because, there's the high likelihood of all these kind of states going after companies in a slightly different way. And we really do need kind of a unified approach.
And we'll talk a little bit about that more later on.
Yeah.
When we start talking about, some of the current proposals out there and the issues with them. But let's turn a little bit. Let's continue talking about the policy responses a little bit more by first, talking about, a few months ago, we got all these emails asking us to give our affirmative consent to receive emails.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Yeah, so it wasn't just a couple months ago.
Yeah, it's been
almost literally a year.
Now.
It's been almost literally a year.
You're
Yeah,
right.
so now we're in May, May 25th of last year, 2018. The European General Data Protection Regulation went into effect, and it really was this massive, impactful regulation that if you're a multinational corporation, which Pinterest and Twitter and Facebook and Google clearly are, if you're using any type of these social media, they're going to be sending you a note and saying, hey, we've got to update our privacy policies in order to be compliant with GDPR, which is what a lot of companies did. There's a whole bunch of other companies that just said, okay, you know what, GDPR is really costly for us to comply with, which it is. I'm actually doing some research right now to try to calculate what that looks like, but it's very expensive for most companies.
I imagine it's got to be a huge impact on those companies.
Yeah,
especially small business companies.
Yeah, small businesses. Well, interestingly enough, small businesses seem to be able to export that. So at least with the regulatory costs, and when we talk about small businesses, I think what most people think about are probably what you would consider like medium-sized businesses.
Okay.
Which is where there's a lot of these firms there's a lot of these firms. So like when we talk about truly small business, I mean, I typically think of maybe 1 to 20 employees, which is truly a small business. That's where the bulk of firms exist in the space. But if you're talking about where employees typically are, so if you're working for somebody, you're in kind of the medium enterprise space to large companies. And we do see that there is clearly an effect that medium companies, the medium-sized companies, and these are the companies that do exist, they are clearly being impacted by the rules. It seems to be probably more costly for them overall than it is for the large businesses, just because large businesses usually are the biggest firms are usually a little bit more profitable, so they're just able to kind of disperse those costs over the entirety of the company. Needless to say, where I think that we should be concerned about the impacts is in this kind of medium business space. It's not the ultra small firms, because a lot of those. There will be impacts in the small firms. Don't get me wrong. Probably there's a couple of them. It seems like, not a couple of them, but it seems like some of them will probably exit the market, especially people that are older, that have a small, I was reading recently in one of the Silicon Valley papers, I was at San Jose Mercury, I believe it's called. There was a guy who runs a flower shop, and he said that he's not going to probably be able to be compliant with CCPA, which is this California law. And he said he's probably going to have to exit. But he also said that primarily it's because this is a new set of regulations. He's older. He's not really able. He's like, I'm towards kind of nearish retirement. Like, I might as well just kind of, slip into retirement and kind of make that transition. So I think think that's probably what we'll see. We'll see some transition of these older businesses. There'll probably be a big impact for this. Like I said, there will be costs that small businesses will have to bear. But then these medium-sized businesses, which do employ a lot of people, will I expect to be impacted the most.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to wait for your paper on that one.
Yeah.
So one of the other impacts that I think we've all seen with GDPR is, I don't live in Europe. Why am I being affected by this? How is a European law affecting my work?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And that's, I believe somebody termed this the long arm of regulation, which I thought was kind of a good turn of phrase, that what the GDPR does is it has a long arm. And that's also what we're seeing with this California law as well, that California is, the CCPA is only really relegated to the state of California, but companies all across the United States are assuming they're going to have to be compliant just because of the potential number of customers that could get caught up in Europe. So I'm sorry, not in Europe, but in California. So this happens. Why you're seeing these emails is because of this long arm of regulation. The internet is everywhere. It really is it traverses all borders. It's a very permissive kind of technology. And if you want to regulate something on the internet, you have to regulate it really everywhere. I mean, I say that kind of, it's a little bit hyperbolic to say that you have to regulate it everywhere, but it's really difficult to just say, okay, these are the small firms that are going to be located within California, and they are the ones that are going to be regulated. That's not going to happen. Other firms, because they have California customers, because they do business in California, because of any number of reasons, perhaps maybe even they're just not very risk tolerant. Like, hey, we do enough business in California, we probably could kind of skate under the threshold, but there's no reason to really to chance it, so might as well just become compliant with California law. And that's really what's happening within GDPR as well.
Okay, so sketch out for us what some of these various policy proposals do.
So the big one obviously is California. So California really there's a couple different elements of California, but it gives four different rights to consumers, and it's really this kind of rights-based approach, as it may be dubbed. So you have the right to delete information, the right generally to know what's being talked about you, the right to to delete information to very, very specific options, the right to I'm forgetting the fourth one, but I know one of the other ones is basically the ability to use services without the requirement of having all of your information processed and collected. So there are what California is effectively trying to do is give consumers a set of a set of what they're dubbing rights, which is I think a very fraught term here, but basically it's a whole bunch of requirements on companies that specifically say you have to give consumers the ability to delete information, to correct information, to know about what is being collected about you. Some of that I think is probably pretty solid overall. That there's transparency requirements I think are generally a positive thing, but really the big question, the big tension here comes in the fine structure. How does this really integrate within, one of the big tensions right now is how does it integrate within class action lawsuits? There's a lot of really bigger questions about.
And that's going to be really tough to implement.
Yeah. I mean, the state now is trying to go in and kind of clean up some of the laws and make sure that it isn't going to be completely onerous. So I think that actually is a positive thing, all things considered. So the funny thing about CCPA, which we haven't mentioned, is that CCPA was introduced and passed within 1 week.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that because you said they're now cleaning up some of this stuff.
Yeah, isn't that fun?
Wouldn't that be something you would do before you passed said legislation?
So the options for CCPA at the time, and this was about this time last year, it was June of last year that all this kind of happened. California had, and it was pushed by an organization, by a group of individuals that were very interested in doing a California amendment. And because of the way that the referendum system works within California, that what you do is you have an amendment, it gets added to California law, and it's really, 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 really hard to amend it. Anyway, even the legislature just can't really do very much. And the way that it was written, I don't think that people recognize they want privacy, but at the same time, if you were to have some very, very onerous requirements on what companies can and cannot do, you also would have it would completely shift the market. One of the things that we've seen very clearly in GDPR is that the venture capitalist space has I don't want to say dried up, but it has greatly diminished over the last year since GDPR was implemented, and specifically in the industries that you would expect. So like in social media and news production, in kind of the advertising supported and data supported spaces that you would expect, the entire VC funding for these areas has decreased by about a third, if I recall correctly. So there are clear impacts, because why would you put your money into data collection or a data collection service when consumers could sue you for millions of dollars if you don't handle that correctly? And that to me is one of the big problems and one of the big tensions that we're trying to figure out here is what's that right balance between giving consumers privacy protections and then also ensuring that there is kind of this innovative ecosystem that's supporting new technologies that are supporting the new firms that potentially could go after Facebook or Google in the ways that you would want them to go after Facebook and Google. But I think the actual implementation and the way that it affects the industry is that you just further entrench those large dominant players instead of actually allowing new markets to come in, or new entrants to come into the market and disrupt them.
And now to complicate this even further, we're now seeing other states are starting to follow suit. We're also seeing cities starting to follow suit.
Yeah.
This seems to me that it's just going to complicate everything.
Yeah. So the one state that seems that was probably going to pass something, again, it didn't end up passing anything, was the state of Washington. So Washington was looking to pass a law. It was a little bit more similar to the GDPR in the way that it was. So the California way of dealing with things, it's much more rights based and say, okay, you're a consumer, you have specific rights. GDPR is much more about this. It's almost kind of like a relationship. So you've got data, you've got what are called data subjects, so individuals, and you've got data processors and data controllers. So it's much more about this relationship between these kind of three different groups that are made out of thin air, effectively. That's what Washington State was very similar. It was it looked very similar in some key ways to GDPR, in that it was concerned more about kind of the processes instead of just the pure rights. You effectively get very similar sorts of regulation at the end result, but that recently failed. But Washington State was not the only state that's involved in this and interested in doing this. There have been bills in Montana, I believe in Iowa, Hawaii. I know Hawaii is another bill that'll probably get passed in this legislative session for Hawaii. So that's coming. New York City has said that they're interested in doing something for their own bill. And my home city of Chicago has talked about this. They've got a draft bill out there right now that is not really going anywhere. But the big problem, which I think you were alluding to, is that you have all of these states and cities that are doing something that's slightly different. And so you have to be compliant with something that is really, really difficult to be compliant in. How do you know that unless you start collecting information, really deep personal information about me, how do you know that I'm in Illinois? Which I do go back, I still have family there, but I live in Washington, D.C. now. How do you know that I'm in Illinois and not in Washington, D.C.? Or how do you know that I'm in California and not in New York City? So,
well, they'll have to have your data.
Exactly. But that's more privacy invasive. So and this is like I think the subtle problem with privacy laws. In order for privacy laws to be enacted, you have to collect more information about individuals to be sure that you know correct information about them. Because of that, it really actually makes the entire process, I think, far more invasive in a way that we wouldn't want it to be invasive. And in fact, I think we should be focused much more on privacy risks, which means, disclosure of certain kinds. You potentially would regulate health data, but you need to be smart about that. We do already regulate health data, but perhaps you're just, we do some more targeted things on that. Maybe some geolocation information has certain kind of protected class status. I think there's smart ways to do this, but that's not what we're talking about right now. We're just talking about throwing everything into the fray and kind of just seeing what sticks.
So is all this going to prompt a federal response?
Yeah, I think that at the end, I would wait to see how it kind of shakes out. I don't think we'll probably see something this year with privacy. I could be wrong. I don't think you'll see movement. I should say it differently. I think you will see movement. You'll see, there's supposed to be the Senate is currently working on a bill. So, Wicker, Moran, Blumenthal, and Schatz are working also with Cantwell and Thune. So it looks like the 6 of them are working on a bill together. Thune has been talking a lot about this in the past. Cantwell has been working on this. So there was a lot of leadership in this space. You'll probably see that bill, and that really has been what a lot of people have been concerned about. So that's something to watch. But, what happens in the House? The House is, I think, a little bit more divided. They're just not as far along in the process of thinking through privacy. There's been a whole bunch of hearings. There was as of this taping, there was a hearing this week, and I know that there's more hearings coming up on privacy. So I don't think we'll see something necessarily federally this year, but I think there's going to be a drumbeat that will come because there's the potential for states to really get into the fray and to do something that's kind of bad. And California, again, who knows what happens with California, but perhaps you have also a different set of laws that comes out of Hawaii, and then out of Washington, and then out of Oregon, and then out in New York and Illinois and Florida and Texas. And so then you've got this, I don't want to say it's a patchwork because it's not really a patchwork. It is just layers and layers and layers of regulation instead of, it's not patchwork because you can't tell where individuals are located. So it's just a difficult way of actually doing business. If that happens, then I think you could probably see a federal privacy law. Yeah,
sounds very complicated. But as we wrap up this conversation, we should mention the great booklet that you put together.
Yes.
Thank
you for plugging my work. Yes. Thank you for plugging. So yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the big issues that we've been at American Action Forum. We're really just trying to understand. We're trying to understand what's going on with this policy. So, I got together with some 5 other really sharp individuals who are working in this space. They are, young and hungry scholars who I think are really, really amazing. And so we've collected a whole bunch of different essays from them on everything from AI to privacy, which is what we've been talking about, what's happening at the Supreme Court, and then also just generally how to think about regulation. So that's something that I am really quite proud of, and you should definitely check out. There's a lot to be said about this, and it's really just, I think, kind of the beginning of our work in getting these types of scholars working on these issues. But that really is it's really a beginning to the conversation. It really only gives you just kind of the bare bones of how to approach it. And really there's a lot more that I would like to do. And I think there's just a lot more scholarship and work that needs to be done in this space.
Yeah. Well, you got to start somewhere.
Yep.
All right. So let's bring the conversation full circle now. Will, what is new in the coffee world?
Fourth wave. No. So at least personally to me, I moved to a new home, and there is this really, really good, at least in Washington, D.C., there's this really good roaster in D.C. that I hadn't been to before, but obviously it's been getting good reviews for years, called Sidamo. Really good Ethiopian coffees. Pretty sure the guy is Ethiopian. Very nice, amazing coffee. Highly suggest it. Gave some to my parents, and they are big Starbucks drinkers, as we were talking about earlier. So really, to bring it full circle, they were completely impressed, and now I'm actually having to send more to them. So that's actually been fun, because now I'm supporting their coffee habits, which is, of course, a really cheap habit to be involved in. But coffee's coffee. I guess maybe drink Starbucks, but I don't know.
Well, next time you come back, we'll have to hear more about what new coffee adventure you found.
Yes. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. I'd also like to encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes from this episode, and also follow us on social media to hear more about AAF.